Sumay, I found the meaning of life.
What? Really? What is it?
Flow state.
Oh my god.
So,
I've been learning about flow state. I've been reading about flow state. I've been watching videos about flow state. And I've discovered that nobody really knows what it is. And basically, they're kind of just talking about it like it's correlated with other things. Like,
so it's like if you were to talk about eating, but saying when you are eating, you
start to feel fullness
you
in your
start
stomach.
to feel fullness in your stomach, and oftentimes you create an up and down motion with your jaw.
Yeah.
And it's like
not actually explaining what it is.
Teeth seem to be related in the action of eating. And it's like, but that's completely different than talking about fundamentally what it actually is.
Yeah.
And defining it.
And I think that there's really, it's not like we're blaming anybody for this.
No, we're not.
I think that it is an incredibly complicated topic, and some people are literally saying that it's like the meaning of life
Is to be in flow state all the time.
Yeah, because it's such like a feeling of, elation. It's just like what all these people are talking about when they talk about correlation with flow state is like increase
It's just
in
amazing.
all the is all the like chemicals involved in like dopamine and serotonin and all those like positive feelings and all those things that are involved in basically just feeling like effortless effort and like feeling a sense of oneness, and people will use all these terms to describe
feeling like nothing can stop you, and basically the most amazing thing in the world is what you're doing.
Yeah, and so I think that what we've basically been kind of trying to break down recently is like what's actually going on in the brain, where do emotions come from, where do thoughts come from, where does imagination come from, and all of these different things. And one thing that we've recently made a breakthrough with is kind of just understanding what the subconscious mind is and how important it is.
As well as what the conscious mind is and how they work together, which we call the one body problem.
Yeah, so it's kind of like when you think about consciousness, we humans tend to prioritize consciousness, and it makes a lot of sense because consciousness literally means like what you are aware of.
Yeah.
And so if it's not part of your consciousness, you're literally not aware of it, so of course you're going to think that that is an outsized part of our world because it is literally like the outsized part of your perception, which it is your perception.
So like right now, if you're watching this video, I'd hope you'd be paying attention to what I'm saying. Maybe you're focusing on like, oh, I think I have that plant Sumay has right there, or something like that. Maybe you're thinking primarily about the words and you're not actually even aware of like the visual things on the screen. But it's all about what you're aware of. And the thing about that is that we can actually only be aware of a very small amount of information in 1 second.
And it's about, if you actually measure it, scientists have tried to measure it, and people come up with different conclusions. It's hard to actually know, but they've come up with around anywhere from 10 to 60 bits per second.
Yeah.
And so that is very, very limited. And
coming from all your senses, you can only consciously be aware of 16 bits. So you got to choose. Like right now, I wasn't focusing on the senses coming in from touch. I was mainly focused on what I'm hearing and interpreting the words. Right. So sometimes you're not even aware of certain senses.
Yeah. So basically, when it comes to the processing power of your subconscious mind, it's around 10 to 20 million
compared
bits per
to
second.
16 bits per second.
So compared to 10 to 60 bits per second of the conscious mind.
Yeah.
And what really matters is not the actual numbers, but the magnitude of in terms of processing power. And that's actually really important, at least for us, in terms of trying to understand the human brain, because at first it's kind of like, generally when people talk about the subconscious, it's like, oh, this is the older, more animalistic, more impulse-based parts of the brain that are more, basic, less sophisticated.
Yeah, like,
right?
Oh, my subconscious wants me to like binge watch Netflix right now. Right. Like, come on, subconscious mind.
Yeah. And so, but I think that what's important to understand about it is that it's just so much more powerful in terms of processing power.
Yeah.
And that one, it's incredibly good at finding patterns and making connections because it has access to all your memories. Like you can be, like, for example, your subconscious stores these memories from your past, and you might not even be consciously aware that you still remember something.
Yeah.
But then if it's relevant, your subconscious will give it to your conscious, and you'll remember something from your past that you didn't even know that you remembered.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can't be consciously aware of all the memories, right? That's just like way, way, way larger than 10 to 60 bits per second.
So you have a lot more memories than you actually realize.
Yeah.
A lot more.
Yeah.
A lot.
And so what's so important about this is that essentially you kind of have two beings operating in your brain. And sometimes they're fighting with each other. Sometimes your subconscious is like, you know, I really want a cookie, right? And then the conscious overrides, and the conscious is more logical, and the conscious
That's
has
what willpower is.
Yeah, the willpower is your conscious overriding your subconscious.
And it's hard.
And it's hard because you're literally fighting with yourself.
Yeah.
And that kind of is almost a little bit wasteful in terms of energy, right?
Well,
you're
it's extremely wasteful. If the goals of your conscious and subconscious are not aligned, then you can feel like like you said, you're fighting yourself. You're wasting so much energy because you are not aligned in what you want.
Yeah.
But flow state is actually the opposite. That's why it feels so effortless.
Yeah, that's why we're saying waste is that there's an alternative. And so basically, if you think about flow state along two axes, you can think about alignment. And alignment is essentially if you because it's kind of, you can think about your conscious and subconscious as two different beings. Mm-hmm. You don't have to, but it's a helpful mental model.
I think it depends on how you define beings. Yeah. I have trouble with that because
if you define an entity
as kind of creepy.
It is kind of creepy. I would say that if you define entity as something possessing its own motivations, and your conscious and subconscious mind can have different motivations, then you could say that there's two entities in your brain. Yeah. Right, which is kind of creepy.
That makes sense.
But it's still a way of thinking about it.
If you define it as entity that way, then that makes sense.
And so I think that, one is alignment in terms of one axis. Mm-hmm. And flow state means maximal alignment between your conscious and subconscious goals. But then there's also a different aspect, which is the dominant function. And basically what I mean is your conscious brain primarily in control, or is your subconscious brain primarily in control? Yeah. And so if you think about this as a grid with four basically different mental states, we kind of basically, I came up with like one word terms for these. One is flow or flow state, which basically means high alignment, but the dominant function is the subconscious brain. And
so
this
basically
is really
your subconscious is leading you.
Yeah, and this is really important because the subconscious has so much processing power. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's also really important in terms of understanding what the difference between the subconscious and conscious, and in terms of the magnitude of processing power, is that when your conscious is in control, it takes more energy and effort. You get tired faster because the conscious brain is more limited. Yeah. But if your subconscious is essentially the one that's flowing, people talk about subconscious as the one with instinct and intuition. And if you're leading with that intuition, that's when it just, and you have high alignment between, complete alignment between your conscious and subconscious. There's no fighting with yourself. It's just, it feels like effortless effort because your subconscious in control with its millions of bits per second.
Yeah.
So that, I think, really explains from a fundamental level what flow is. But to talk about the other mental states just briefly, like when people talk about flow, they can say, I'm in the zone, or I'm trusting my gut. But then if you talk about, what about high alignment, but the conscious mind is in control instead? This is something where it still feels like you're not fighting with yourself, but it's still taking more effort. And this is what people might call being focused, right? Mm-hmm. That you might say I'm making it happen, or I'm on top of things. Yeah. Right? But then there's also other states in which there's low alignment. And low alignment is when there starts to become problems, because you essentially might be a little bit adrift in terms of your goals, and your goals might be conflicting between the conscious and subconscious. And this is when you start wasting energy. And so one is let's say you have low alignment, but your subconscious is in control, you might call this like drift, and it's just kind of like being out of control and being carried away. You
Unfocused,
yeah.
just like flying all over the place. Not really sure what you're doing.
Yeah. And then there's also, in terms of the last mental state, you might be calling this like overthinking, where you are not aligned in terms of your goals. You might be lacking of goals.
Maybe feeling some anxiety as well.
Yeah. And then, but your conscious mind is in control. And so then you're kind of, you're not really sure what you're doing, and you're kind of wasting energy because your conscious mind is in control, and that's going to be strain on the conscious mind to try to do everything by itself. And so people might talk about this as being like stuck in their head or trying too hard. Basically any kind of low alignment state is pretty not the best. You generally don't feel very good in those states. And so I think that this is a really, really good mental model in terms of understanding why we feel the way we feel, but then also how we can try to improve towards these states. And I think that that's why I think it's really important. It makes sense why people would even go so far as to say that flow state is the meaning of life, because one, a big part of flow state
feels good.
Yeah. Well, there's that. But I think that there's kind of like the one necessary condition of having flow state is you need to know your goals. And that's a big part of life. Like defining your goals is almost like defining the meaning of your life. Right? Because in order for you to have a goal, you're prioritizing something above everything else. And that means defining who you are. That means defining the world to some extent, and trying to optimize a path through that. And so I think that it definitely makes sense that people would have trouble reaching flow state, given that it's hard to understand yourself, and it's exceptionally hard to try to understand an incredibly complicated world that's constantly changing, where you're getting so much information overload. And part of this is also, we wanted to do a separate conversation about how phones and screens and social media and these sorts of things can actually numb the subconscious by providing too much stimulation. So there's a lot of factors as to why people would be struggling to reach alignment, and then also be able to reach subconscious dominance. And one big reason for this is because the subconscious, its primary goal is to keep you alive. And now people are watching the news all day telling me like, there was an explosion in this country, and we're global warming, and like
you're
all of these things.
You're constantly getting information around threats and information around danger. And it's like, of course that's not going to help your subconscious. Like, your subconscious isn't going to want to focus on, I don't know, writing a paper if it's like, it still has its
risk assessment.
It still has its mind back in like somewhere else in the world with this one tragedy.
If your subconscious thinks that there's any risks, you have no hope of helping your subconscious focus on something else.
That's why like sometimes when you get in front of a crowd and you haven't been in front of like cameras or a crowd or something before, then you'll choke. You know, it's where your subconscious just turns off because it's so focused on,
and then
like,
you can't access that memory, that
you
intuition.
Can't access the somehow you don't know what you're doing. Why am I here? Why am I here? What's going on? What am I supposed to say? You know?
And so that explains a lot in terms of like what's actually happening and why do those things happen. And so that's part of a necessary condition for accessing flow state is, first, you need to feel safe. And we call this like a sanctuary. And a sanctuary is basically a place in which you can feel safe, and your subconscious has associated that place with safety.
Well, the sanctuary is actually where you feel as safe as possible, that your subconscious can just completely relax. Like you know, right now I would say I'm very relaxed, but I'm not completely in my sanctuary, you know? The sanctuary is like, you're so relaxed you could literally just pass out if you wanted to. Usually that's gonna be like in your house, in your room, or maybe just a familiar book or audiobook you listen to.
And so another necessary condition for flow state is also having clear goals. And when it comes to clear goals, I'm mostly talking about the conscious brain, because if your conscious brain doesn't understand what's going on, then you're not going to be able to find alignment between your conscious and subconscious goals, right? Is because that you can't do that if you don't have goals, right? And so you want to have clear goals, but more than that, you also want to make sure that that's aligned with your subconscious. And you'll know that because your emotions, your subconscious will speak to you through your emotions, right? You can either, you can say like, oh, we're going to do this now. And then you're going to either feel a lot of motivation and a lot of joy, or you're just going to be like, oh, I don't want to do that right now. And that means your subconscious is not, it was not on board, right? And so that means you're not at alignment yet. Right. And so it's about listening to your emotions and trying to understand why your emotions are there, because it's one thing to observe your emotions and it's an entirely other thing to understand why they're happening and what your subconscious is actually trying to say. And so that's a really, really difficult process. And it often has to come from a lot of reflection, but also engaging with other people you love, trying to talk through those emotions. And, writing, I think writing is a process of essentially trying to build understanding and alignment between your two, your conscious and subconscious brain.
When you're writing, you literally just have your subconscious talking, because it's like, also when you're talking,
if you get in a flow with writing.
If you get in a flow state, especially when you're in a flow state, and especially when you're talking to someone you really trust, because I'm not overthinking like every single word I'm saying right now. My subconscious is talking primarily here now. And it's really weird to think about. Like, you can literally think about what you're doing in this specific moment, like what's driving me here. Maybe you're watching the video because you're procrastinating on your work, and your subconscious is not aligned in the goal of doing your work. And it's like, being aware of that is so interesting, because if you might not even, like, we didn't know before that we had this extra being inside our mind. But learning about it is so important, because if you can do that, then you can harness that a million times more powerful version of you.
And so when it comes to the last necessary condition, I think if you talk about, okay, you have sanctuary, you have clear goals, you've built alignment, your subconscious is on board. All right. The last thing you also need is experience, because if you don't have experience doing something, then you haven't built up the intuition to
your
do
subconscious
it,
can't act because it has nothing to draw from.
Exactly. And so if you're first learning a new sport, you're not going to reach a flow state. But if you're doing a sport that you've been doing for years, it's going to be
what muscle memory is.
It's going to be really easy for you to reach a flow state, because your subconscious has all of that experience. It has that intuition.
It's like, conscious mind, I got this, let's go. And then you just, like, the intuition is amazing. You're acting without even thinking about it.
And that's what that learning curve is initially it's such a struggle, because your conscious mind at 10 to 60 bits per second is trying to, like, process things and trying to use its willpower to do something, which is pretty exhausting. But then as you continue to build up more and more subconscious intuition, your subconscious can connect the dots and find patterns and build more experience. That's when it starts to become more and more effortless. And I think that this is incredibly important to understand for exactly the reason that you said, is that you have a part of yourself that is a million times more powerful than you can conceive of. And that's just a complete mind blow.
And who doesn't want to reach flow, right? Who doesn't want to have that flow state where you can, effortlessly do things that you thought were impossible? And it's like, that's what you can reach with this, instead of just following these things of like, oh, maybe if you, like, have the right amount of challenge and the right amount of intuition, but not too much. And it's like, that's really hard to follow and get all of those things right. That's a lot harder than really understanding fundamentally what makes flow.